What if you could help others to find the power to heal themselves? Physically, emotionally, and spiritually.
When I started teaching my classes, it was in 2002, and I was just doing the past life regressions and contacting the subconscious part. But then as the time went on and we found how powerful this was and what we could do with it, a lot of the students began saying, you know, advanced past life regression doesn't really tell what it's all about. This is so much more than that. We think you should change the name. So it was a few years ago we decided to change the name to Quantum Healing Hypnosis Technique. And this is the healing technique that we've now been teaching it, well, since 2002, that's 12 years.
What if you could time travel with them? Visit mythical places or angelic realms, other worlds, other galaxies. Help others to speak to their higher selves. You can. Dolores has taught thousands of people from across the world how to use QHHT, and now you can learn her method by going directly to dolorescannon.com. And don't forget to mention the discount code MORETALKS.
Established over 100 years ago, Watkins Books is one of the world's oldest and leading independent bookshops specializing in esoterica. We have the widest selection of esoteric books in the UK, and our friendly and knowledgeable staff are here to assist you in a unique ambience of our shop. So come and visit us in the heart of London as we're open every day.
The More Show is supported by Mindscape, Paranormal and UFO Matrix magazines, available for download on all major digital platforms.
You're listening to The More Show, and here's your host, Kevin Moore.
Welcome back to the show. We're about to be joined with our guest, Glenn Steckling. Just a bit of background on Glenn. He assumed the responsibilities of his father's work in the field of UFO and ET research since his father, Mr. Fred Steckling, passed away in 1991. Mr. Steckling's latest revision to his father's book, Alien Bases on the Moon, now Alien Bases on the Moon 2, contains a combination of over 100 NASA photographs, challenging the continued myth behind the dead moon and inhospitable planet theories, and exposes the increasing possibility of extraterrestrial activity there. Glenn, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Kevin. It's a pleasure to be with you and your listeners.
Now, Glenn, just tell me a bit about your father's work on alien bases on the moon and how you continued his work.
It's actually a two-part story, but dealing with the lunar photographs and the NASA photographs, in the mid-1960s, my father was invited to go to Goddard Space Flight Center and to present before 22 scientists, and as well as to the Pentagon, Colonel Freeman, for the same, and later via Lord Clancarty to the House of Lords as well. And due to this access that he gained and the communication he established, as the years progressed, certain particular scientists directed him towards departments where he could write to and to purchase lunar materials. And by the time of the mid-70s, we had come towards the end of the Apollo program, and a lot of these pictures were available on microfilm and microfiche and catalogs, and so he ordered them and paid for them. And for many, many hours, many, many months, we went together through these pictures and ordered them via catalog number, then received the 15 by 20 high gloss Hasselblad photographs, and which he put together in the book Alien Bases on the Moon, which he wanted to show that there was more activity than the dead moon theory or the 1/6 gravity theory, these old concepts that we grasp onto for many, many decades and never change teaching our school children.
What actually led your father to write the book, Bases on the Moon? And what was George Adamski's involvement with the book as well?
Well, having to do with George, and George in the 1950s had, for many people who may not remember George Adamski, he was considered the pioneer in the UFO field. And he took not only a series of telescopic photographs, but he interacted with many scientists near the base of Mount Palomar, where the huge 200-inch observatory resides. And he interacted with the government, and then oftentimes he was given government pass in order to provide information to them as well. And so as time progressed, these materials that became to my father's hand through George Adamski and his contacts opened the doors in different channels, like I mentioned before, NASA and the Pentagon and what other channels, in order to directly show our officials and our military leaders the type of material that he felt they needed to know, and exactly what George Adamski did before him when he went before Queen Juliana and he received the Papal Medal of Honor from John the 23rd, by producing this material to let our leaders know, because they're the ones who do the decision-making process for the rest of the people, what information is pertinent and how they can go about releasing it to the public. And so that led him towards the book Alien Bases on the Moon, because George had described conditions on the moon to be different than what we were telling our people. He described low atmospheric pressure in some sectors, a great deal of water, which of course in today's news is tons and tons of water on the moon. But this is by no means a new story, and I'll give you an example. I have in my hands here an article, a release from NASA from 1971 that says moon water detected by Dr. John Freeman, who was one of the scientists my father spoke to as well. And it says that Apollo 12 and 14 astronauts detected moon geysers, or spraying water that lasted 7 to 14 hours through their instrumentation. So we seem to be seeing a repetition of material that is released over generational spans of time, and perhaps that's a way of it not being as noticed. But we already talked about moon water then in '70, and then we released it in the beginning of 1997, and now we're back into it again. So when we talk about more gravity, moon water, atmospheric conditions, and I believe the book has a sufficient amount of pictures to show that there are cloud formations and mists on the moon, and I have documentation from NASA that describes this mist and these cloud formations, and one of the photographs we'll look at later, a lunar orbiter photograph, will show you that. So once again, we're not talking about Tahiti, but we're talking about conditions that are not as barren and desolate as we used to propose, and as we know here on this planet, where life has a chance, it certainly established itself.
Did your father actually go to NASA then, and what was their attitude towards him like? I mean, did they try to debunk him? Was they even aware of the UFO phenomena?
Oh, they were well aware of it. In fact, the introductory letters promoted the materials that he was going to bring, and my father and my mother and another lady by the name of Madeline Rotifer went to NASA, the Goddard Space Flight Center in Greenbelt, Maryland, and sat before these 22 scientists. And to the astonishment of some people it may be, but certainly not to us, these gentlemen not only knew about these crafts, they knew about basically how the propulsion systems, electromagnetic, electrostatic propulsion system works, or free energy as we call it, because the planet produces these hundreds of trillions of watts of energy. And they had ideas upon where they came from and how these people looked and how they may easily walk amongst us. And my father was quite happy to hear that statement, because of course when people walk amongst you, then they have to look like you, otherwise it would stand out. So that particular meeting was extremely positive. So was the one with Colonel Freeman in the Pentagon. This was not ridiculed, criticized, or debunked. We were talking at levels that they were interested in collaborating information that they had obtained themselves. So this is quite a bit deeper than the superficial public relations type of individuals you usually get from such bureaucracies, and I'm sure you've experienced that there in the UK as well.
No, sure. I mean, so the response to the first book in 1981, I believe it was it quite a good response?
Absolutely. Absolutely. The book's got into more than 12 printings, and due to that book, it was delivered, Lord Clancarty arranged for a special meeting in the House of Lords, which my father came there to London and to address them. And the book was delivered to individuals in the royal family that have interest in this particular subject as well. And so, and the book has gone around and around. We've got letters from some people that have involved in the space program and other people who are both in the science or aviation communities. And I would say at least 98% of the response has been extremely positive. Of course, you have some people that disagree, and they're welcome to do so.
So you've updated the book, and we'll get a bit into the bases on the moon in a bit. But let's sort of jump ahead to your father's book, Alien Bases on the Moon. What was it that he discovered in his research? I mean, was the moon dead?
Well, we went through the photographs, and like I mentioned before, the thousands and thousands of pictures of microfilm and microfiche and catalogs. And these pictures come out in about, I would say 2 by 2 or 3 by 3 inches here in the United States by measurement. And then you go and you order them catalog-wise individually. And my father provided all the catalog numbers for these pictures in his book to make sure that there was public access. And he made a statement that he does not wish to embarrass the government. He realizes that, of course, they are extremely short-staffed and understaffed, both financially and employment-wise, and there's not enough people to go through and examine everything, all the data they've collected. And in fact, sadly, so much data resides in NASA now that the data readers are obsolete. No one knows how to use them. So there's a great waste of material, which is unfortunate. And he acknowledged their efforts, congratulated for the immense courage it took the astronauts to go to the moon, and also said, well, here's information that I found. And in these pictures, you will find not only sunrise with the lunar module flying along the horizon rim, and when you look at these pictures, and I'm happy to say I have 1970 version pictures in the vault, these large Hasselblad pictures, which shows and proves, of course, the lunar module and the lunar lander in orbit as Earthrise comes up, and etc. So these are things that cannot be faked. And even some of the individuals who are proclaiming today that all this thing was just a publicity hoax, when they looked at those pictures, they said there's no way that it can be. So we have some exploiters in this particular field, and that'll be an entire another subject. But back to the moon, the picture showed atmospheric haze. It showed cloud coverings, mist coverings that move from crater to crater, formations on the moon that have been examined, my God, for decades. Here's an interesting article that comes, in fact, from the UK, and it talks about here that the England's Royal Astronomical Society reported seeing various geometric-shaped light patterns through certain years and moving 50-mile opaque objects, great white domes, long bridge-like structures, etc., along with including the Russian scientists as well. So the plethora of information points to an activity that is on the moon, and let's face it, as Dr. Carl Sagan said, it's the ideal observation platform in order to take a look and see how we are mucking about on this planet.
So, okay, you do believe that we've been to the moon there, from what you've just said.
Oh, absolutely.
Sure. Regarding the pictures, though, that your father, was able to get from NASA, to write his book, how comes these pictures have not been ordered? And have the pictures, if you went to get the pictures now, have they still have the same strange markings on them, the strange landscapes?
Some yes and some no. Yes, the pictures through the 1980s, a number of individuals have taken the catalog numbers and ordered pictures, and some of them they have gotten exactly being the same. In later years, they found some pictures that were much more, shall we say, striking and much more relevant to have been slightly washed or fuzzed, and apparently somebody has gained themselves a little overtime work having to go through and look at some of these pictures as well. So I would say that we only showed about, a mere fraction of, you think about the tens of thousands of pictures that were taken. And so consequently there's much more evidence to be acquired by anybody who's diligent enough and wants to incur the expense of acquiring this material.
But surely the structures that we're talking about on the moon, these alien bases, I mean, how would it be impossible to hide such a thing, wouldn't it?
Well, I would say nothing is impossible. I mean, look at the technology today and what we're capable of doing. I mean, we know our intelligence communities with all our sophisticated computers and programming. We go to the movie theater and are totally amazed by the type of science fiction movies that Hollywood produces and their real three-dimensional type of imagery. And we have the technology, as they have said in the intelligence community for many years, to basically reproduce a picture of you somewhere doing something where you've never been. And that technology is so good it's very hard to disprove. And so it's not very difficult to cover things up if you really work hard at it. The difficult part, of course, is when you have multi-telescopes looking at a particular event at the same time. And this is one of the things that I tell people all the time. In 1969, when we went to the moon with Apollo 12, one has to remember that there were hundreds of ground-based telescopes, both professional and amateur astronomers, who were watching and following the progress of the capsule to the moon as well, and were able to observe it. So that once again throws away the theory about it having not gone there. And also these individuals have been able to use their telescopes to observe activity on the moon. A very good friend of mine who will be shooting a documentary with me this weekend is a retired aerospace engineer who worked for the government in the electromagnetic field, and he was actually a witness to one of these craft in 1957 touching down on the Adamski property, and also from his military career in the Korean War as well, flying formation in fighters. And so this type of credible witness, this type of information, this starts to give heavy credibility against the skeptics. And of course, the skeptics like to do their thing as much as possible because it causes and creates controversy, and that works towards a particular purpose as well.
Yes, but surely why have other observers that have studied the moon not come forward into the mainstream media? I mean, why hasn't the mainstream media reported moon anomalies?
Well, they have. In fact, there's a article from 1978 called Moon Glows by no other than Patrick Moore, whom is a very touted individual in the astronomical community there in the UK. And the article talks about there are patches of reddish glowing areas, reports too numerous to dismiss easily, and historically bright lights moving across the lunar surface, active volcanoes, so on and so forth. So I think that's not an entirely correct statement. I think that there are plenty of people who've spoken out. I mean, astronauts like Gordon Cooper, Edgar Mitchell, a few others have come forth. There's a gentleman who used to own the patents to all the NASA telecommunications. He designed them, he invented them, and his book is called Our Ancestors Came from Outer Space by Maurice Chatelain. And it describes in here categorically every Mercury, Gemini, Apollo mission and how each of them were escorted by and witnessed craft of extraterrestrial origin flying alongside the modules. So there's a tremendous amount of material. Of course, there's a tremendous amount of volume of anything, and to weed through it all can be rather confusing. So one has to use a critical eye in what kind of information you're looking for and how rational and plausible it is.
So, ground-based telescopes can pick up anomalies or, moving light from the moon then?
Absolutely. I've got a photograph here that I can also upload to you for later viewing. It comes from the Mount Wilson Observatory in the 1930s of Cassendi Crater, or what we call Cassendi Greater. There's two of them, a large and a small. And over a period of decades, the astronomers noticed that there are these long tubular constructions that you can easily see in this photograph as well, across the base of Cassendi Crater and going through the edges of the crater walls and continuing on the other side. And the statement was made that over a period of decades, they noticed that these tubular constructions, straight as an arrow, right angles, clearly not natural phenomena, continue to accelerate, and then at a certain point some would disappear in certain areas and others would be reconstructed in others. So ground-based telescopes absolutely have an opportunity to observe depending on the strength and the quality of the equipment and, of course, your location. One has to pick a prime location where you don't have so much atmospheric humidity and disturbance, higher altitude, clear air, a little bit harder to find these days.
I mean, surely other countries must know what's going on the moon. I mean, you've got India with their own satellites up there now. Why have other countries not come forward with information?
Well, I think that you're getting information as it comes forward. This latest report that tons of water is on the moon comes through the Indian Space Agency and some of it through the Chinese Space Agency, where we have seen a reluctance to reveal information out of the Western agencies. Now we see a pushing by other agencies in different countries. And for a number of years, the Russians were highly active in this. In fact, the Russians in 1975 revealed that there were more than 9 celestial bodies in their solar system. They were, in fact, 12, something that George Adamski already talked about in 1954. And the Russians revealed that in 75, and now I've got the article in front of me that was in the magazine that says how many planets are there. Hint, it's not 9. And when you look at the date, I mean, it's almost a shame to see that we have to wait till 2006 to let information out into the public that the Soviets released in 75 and was available to our officials already as far back as 1955. So perhaps these are the questions we should be asking of our leaders.
So, Glenn, I mean, how long have these bases been on the moon then?
Well, that's anybody's guess, of course. There's no way until we established direct contact, if we have not already, or been able to date structures and what have you. There's no way that anybody can possibly answer that question. It could be decades, it could be thousands of years, it could be tens of thousands of years. Now that's yet to be determined, and I'm sure one of these days when we go there with a public space program and not a private one, or shall we say one that is controlled by bureaucracy or the military industrial establishment, then we will get more and more information. And this is one of the important issues that we should tell the people. Money spent in space is not a waste, and in fact it's proven for every dollar spent in space the return is almost 4. So basically over 300% gain, which there's no way you can reach that in any type of investment in the open market these days. So in other words, for every penny we spend in space, we have gained immeasurable amount of technical ability with our computerization, our resistors, our miniaturization, our health benefits, and the safety issues of global positioning and navigation for our everyday airliners and weather to prevent disasters and what have you. I mean, really, space and space technology touches every single soul on this planet and can be an industry that will employ tens of thousands if we would finally move progressively into space and use it progressively towards the benefit of everyone. And the more we go into space and privatize, as more little companies go there and other countries go there, then more and more of this information becomes revealed. At the present time, or for many decades, there was just single agencies, 1 or 2, that controlled all the information and then released what they thought was pertinent. And that, I believe, is a dangerous combination because you only get what somebody wants you to know.
So, from what you've just said there, then, that, going back to the moon, there is more that we can explore, there's more to find out. Do you think the reason we've not been back is we only just made it in the first place, or have we been warned not to go back?
No, there has been no warning that says that we can't go anywhere. The moon is part of our celestial, planetary, shall we say, realm, for lack of a better word. And no one prevents us from going and initiating what we do within our own planet along our own satellite structure. If we take our aggression into space to other places, then of course we may find that that type of behavior is not so welcome. But going back to the moon, at that particular time when we stopped it was purely political process that wanted to be curtailed simply because they didn't want to go that direction which the space program was supposed to go and President Kennedy pushed so hard and diligently to take us towards. And that was the understanding of our planet and the ability to move beyond it. So whether or not we have progressed with that technology in a more clandestine venue, well, that some people are quite adamant about and believe that once we start experimentations and once we start particular programs, they're never entirely shut down. They continue in one form or another. And there are some researchers who feel that our ability to reach the moon from other launch locations on this planet has never been curtailed.
So, I mean, what do you think is out there on the moon? I mean, the only pictures I've ever seen are, grey, black and white pictures. I mean, what does it look like in color?
Well, there you go. The book does contain some color pictures. And when you listen to the astronauts' descriptions, they're talking about different shades of gray, green, and brown. They're talking about viewing what looks like to be volcanoes with white little peaks on the top of them as they orbit the moon. There's a few pictures of the moon in color. In fact, I recently saw one on the internet probably about 3 months ago that is quite different from, of course, the standard black and white shot that we're so used to seeing. Remember, tens of thousands of pictures were taken by multiple cameras, and we only see, not even a fraction of one fraction to what comes out in public. So once again, we're not looking at Tahiti, but we're looking at variations in structure that beyond what we presently want to teach. And I think there's a certain amount of resistance in many different forms, a resistance by our academic institutions who spend a lot of time promoting both their degrees and their university credentials by furthering old ideas, and there's a great reluctance to renew that. Many different authors have touched upon that. I think a fine gentleman there in the UK by the name of Graham Hancock has written several books having to do with archaeology and how we resist looking at older than what we would like to consider historical structures or paintings or carvings because that challenges our predetermined disposition towards ideas. And that's the same thing that applies here. There was one scientist who said, it's unfortunate that science advances one funeral at a time. So basically he's saying that there's such a great resistance inside these structures themselves that often information doesn't leak out. And sometimes it does.
Okay, Glenn, we're going to take a break there, so stay tuned and we'll be right back.
To connect with the show, email kevin@themoore.co.uk. You're listening to The Moore Show, and here's your host, Kevin Moore.
Welcome back to the show. I'm joined here with our guest, Glenn Steckling, where we've been discussing his book, Alien Bases on the Moon, Volume 2. Now, Glenn, you've been calling these structures on the moon bases, but what else could they be?
Well, we are by far not the only ones who have looked at the lunar issue. There was a book by George Leonard in the mid-'70s called Somebody Else is on the Moon. And by far another book that's actually quite good, it's called Moongate, which is the NASA military cover-up, and that was written in 1982 by William Bryan II, that discusses suppressed findings of the U.S. space program, according to the title on his book. And so, there is talk about structures that are quite large, several thousand feet high. One of them was mentioned looking like a giant Van de Graaff generator hanging on the edge of a thin blade with multiple appendages on the side of it. There's other talks about seeing in the deep craters the movement of lights, different colors, and other types of constructions. And we have to think about this logically here. We know that on sea level we have a certain atmospheric pressure here on this planet. And we know when we go below sea level, that atmospheric pressure compresses. So, for instance, if you go to the Dead Sea, which is closer to your realm of the world, or Death Valley Desert, which is over here in my area of the world, As it's below sea level, you get more compression of atmosphere. And as you go higher up in the mountains, you get less. So the deeper you go in craters below the so-called lunar sea level, then you have a higher compressibility of the type of atmospheric conditions that reside there. So what may be very thinly veiled on the lunar sea level surface, on the front side of the moon, can be more compressed in the deeper craters that you go. The front side of the moon is susceptible to the huge titanic gravitational pull of the Earth, whereas the back side of the moon is not. But if we look at that gravitational pull based on 1/6 mathematical computations of Sir Isaac Newton, the lunar neutral gravity point, or what we call the L1, or the distance between the Earth and the moon, where the moon's gravity would be 0, would be 26,000 miles. And you'll see this on our website if you look at it. In actuality, according to Dr. Werner von Braun and all his scientists and everyone else, when they were shot for the Apollo program, lunar gravity L1 was actually 43,000 miles away from the moon. And this is not just mere doubling, because gravitational force is an exponential equation. So it can be as high in certain areas of lunar gravity as much as 60%. Some researchers, including my father, pointed this out. When the astronaut jumps up and down in front of the camera with a 200-pound pack, he jumps only 18 inches high. Or when the lunar rover moves around the moon, you can see the dust spewing off the back of the tires, and as it spews out, it falls back to the surface. If this would be a vacuum, what medium would pull these molecules and these dust particles back to the surface of the moon so quickly? Questions that need to be looked at viably. And it could go on and on and on this subject.
Yeah. I mean, what activity is actually going on the moon, in your opinion?
Well, we looked at one of the photographs I supplied, shows a track system that moves across the lunar surface, down the crater, across the floor of the crater, up the other side.
That's
There's
right.
Another photo in the book.
That's right.
Another photo in the book shows that there is a picture where there are twin tracks. There are two objects that are moving across the surface, one of them leaving a very large track system behind it, and the other one a smaller one that moves across the surface over the top of topography up and down. So, there's some action there as well. Many people have studied what we call the Great Wall area of the moon, the Alpine Valley, in which they claim that they have seen a number of devices, and they see a number of constructions, some of them possibly pyramidal in its make. And of course, we know that is one of the strongest, if you're going to build for longevity, that's one of the strongest structures you can build in pyramid form. So there is, once again, more and more reports, more and more activity on the moon than we like to acknowledge. I have a report here that comes from NASA itself, a document. This document is called the Chronological Listing of Lunar Events, and it came out in April of '66 from Goddard Space Flight Center, no less. And in here, it lists back as far as the 1800s, all the way up to the '66, about the different types of things they looked at. Lunar volcanoes, a strong violet light in another crater, glow on the part of Plato. One of the pictures that we'll see on the website there is from Apollo 12 on the backside of the moon, in which you see an immense luminescent object lighting up the bottom right corner of that picture. Now, when you think about doing an orbit along the dark side or the backside of the moon at that particular time in total darkness, and you look down and you see something that literally lights up hundreds of acres of floor territory, this is a prime example of what we're talking about here.
Sure.
We're talking about faint, milky-looking luminescence, mists over the crater floor, and you'll see mists in the book as well. One orbit shows the crater almost entirely covered, like London in the morning time, and then a few hours later on the next several orbits, the same picture shows that mist moving to the north of the crater. Well, you got to have water, you got to have water vapor, you got to have atmospheric temperature, you have to have some temperatures that are much more benign than what we say minus 200 below zero, in order to even develop these types of atmospheric conditions. So once again, the material is there for those who look deep enough.
So, okay, what do you think is on the dark side of the moon then? Because we've not really touched on that.
Well, the backside of the moon, of course, as I mentioned before, is a little bit more hospitable as far as a gravitational field is concerned, because it doesn't have the immense pull of the Earth as the forward side does. And to give your listeners an idea, we know from the tidal systems in many parts of the world, especially up there in the northern latitudes, that tides can change as much as 40, 50 feet based on certain periods in the lunar equinox. So one can imagine what the Earth must influence the moon on the forward side. But on the back side, you have less of that egg-shaped elongetical pull. And so there are pictures from the backside of the moon that has a great deal more activity. In fact, some of the concentration of microfiche and microfilm from the backside of the moon provides quite a few pictures that are much more controversial. And so I would say, and from what information I've been able to obtain, at a certain point in time when we started to experiment by shooting high-powered lasers and high-powered microwave devices at the front side of the moon, and at one time we were even foolish enough to consider sending a nuclear bomb to the front side of the moon, because there's no end to the insanity of peoples on this planet, that for anybody who was on that side or whatever constructions were there, whether they happen to be extraterrestrial or some of our own constructions, then the reverse side of the moon is a much more, shall we say, safer environment from the type of aggressions that we like to exhibit here.
Sure. So you do believe that we've been going back to the moon since the Apollo missions ended?
I believe that there's sufficient evidence to warrant that as a viable idea, and that we never really stopped going there. There have been I remember once there was a clip, and I can't remember right now off the top of my head, but I believe there was a clip during the Lunar Rover series which would make that the latter Apollos, when they were going towards the edge of the crater and stopped, and then there was some kind of exclamation from one astronaut that said, "Look down here, you wouldn't believe what we're seeing." And of course, you hear Mission Control frantically telling them to switch channels and go to a highly encrypted channel. And so that information didn't come out. And I believe that some of the astronauts were a bit astounded to not only what they saw, but who they also saw.
And have you ever had a chance to speak to the Apollo astronauts at all to sort of verify any of this?
My father had a brief conversation with the late Gordon Cooper, many, many decades ago, and of course we know Edgar Mitchell has come out in favor of this, and some other astronauts as well, talking about that. Of course, some of them will release information, others don't. I mean, we have to understand that we're talking about high commissioned officers in the military services, and we all have secrecy acts that they sign, and the consequences of things that you say that shouldn't be said, and let's face it, the public is not a very supportive entity. We are rapid to want somebody else to convince us of what is and what isn't, and I think that's one of our greatest problems, is that we're constantly looking for somebody else to decipher the information, whether it happens to be through the news media or politics or science or anything else. Give it to us so we don't have to do the work ourselves. We don't have to research. We don't have to do critical thinking. We don't have to use our brain. And the more we do that, the more we relax our own curiosity and our own responsibility towards truth, the less and less of it we get, and the more you get fed nonsense.
True.
And so while some have talked, others have not, and we have to understand that. That's the same in the scientific community. I have quote upon quote of scientists from every major university who says there's life beyond this planet, and then you can find dozens of others who try to deny it. So you have to pick your own sources.
Sure, I mean, and any subject like this, like a black ops project in a sense, still going to the moon, I mean, this would be more classified than anything, wouldn't it? This would be more classified than the Manhattan Project or anything that's been since.
Well, absolutely, and that, of course, is the exact quote. You have a British author who I know for many decades, Timothy Good. He wrote the book Above Top Secret, and several others, in which he categorizes all the different government supports for these type of research, from Project Magnet, Saucer, Azuma, Blue Book, Condon Report. I mean, for something that we are supposedly don't believe and try to debunk and try to deny, we have at least from the 1930s official records of our own organizations doing research and data collecting decade after decade after decade. Nobody wastes their money if there's nothing to see. And as we know by the pictures, there's plenty to see.
Yeah, and it's like you just said there as well. People want others to do it for them, and also, I think if they did come out, and those that do come out with what they know, they're ridiculed, made to be looked, very, very stupid. The whole subject's very ridiculed, purposefully, to sort of give them the edge not to be able to release any information as such.
Well, I think to some degree we only have ourselves to blame for this. Unfortunately, I've grown up in this subject my entire life, from the time of knowing Mr. Adamski as a childhood and going with my father and mother to these organizations and being exposed to this. And I have gone to my fair share of lectures and conferences and things like this. And unfortunately, at one time where we had more of a cover-up, which progressed into a mere mode of silence by official agencies, we have attracted and promoted in this particular field too much sensationalism and too much exploitation, to whereas there is no real need anymore by the government or official agencies to cover things up or to dilute it, because all you have to do is go to one of these conferences, and if you don't come out more confused than when you went in, I'll be very surprised. There is extremely few legitimate sources and exposes of this type of information. And so we have managed, unfortunately, and I say that congruently for all of the people who are involved in this field, to create such a witch's brew of confusion that we do our own disservice.
Yep, that is true. If there is a Black Ops project as such, if there is a secret moon mission still going on, I mean, surely we'd be able to see the launch of such a mission. Are these in such secret locations that they're away from the media and everything else?
Well, I believe that. I believe that at one point there were talk of launch zones in the Indian Ocean and other areas, and I think it's progressed beyond that. At the end of the Apollo era, or through the 1970s, say at least, when we didn't have quite the amount of global exposure as we do now, there were certain areas equatorially located that were remote enough that anyone could launch, and by the time they reached a low orbit, they were in populated zones where nobody pays any attention. How many people look up? So, if you launch from these areas, you've reached already hundreds of miles up before you've reached the mainland of any really industrialized area. And then, of course, there's talk that at a certain point of time, we have continued to examine these type of technologies and to try to replicate them. So we may well be past the point where we do not need a Saturn V or its next upgrade in order to get launch vehicles into space. And that brings up a whole nother idea as well. I mean, basically, we're already looking at the privatized program, which takes and piggybacks a smaller device on basically an airplane and flies it up to high altitude and then shoots it from there, which doesn't have much of a signature or footprint more than several hundred miles that it is. And if we get more sophisticated than that, where we talk about projects like Aurora and some other ones, that we may well have vehicles that some people claim that they see partially in Area 51 and other places that are capable of space orbit without having to use thousands and thousands of pounds of fuel and thrust. And that's a whole other topic in itself right there.
But why lie about going back?
Well, that is because once we established a particular type of mindset, we are very reluctant to change it. And to give you an example, our leaders of today are basically those who have come up from World War II, from the Korean War, through the 50s and 60s. Some of them are advanced age now, have run administrations not too long ago. These people have been involved in multi-levels of things already for 40 or 50 years. And no one is going to say, well, you know, initially we weren't sure what this is, and so we decided to, for your own protection, to be quiet about it and to ascertain and determine for ourselves what this really was. And initially, that's exactly what happened in the 1950s, because our governments and militaries, when the plethora of UFO sightings came, and dozens of them flew over Washington, D.C. and the nation's capital and every capital of the world, all over the country by thousands and thousands of sightings, there was a bit of a nervousness. So they decided for their own determination and protection that they were going to keep quiet and collect more data. There was a point in time when they were actually going to go public with it, and in the United States, General Vandenberg decided to slap that down and not go with it. So we were right on the cusp for a few years, and it would have been far better for us to do so. But we continue policy all around the world, as we do academically as well, promoting the same old ideas for decades and decades, and nobody really wants to peel that back because they don't want to expose either the people who are still alive who initiated or those who worked for them who helped to initiate the policy. And so you can see where there's a great deal of self-preservation, both by the concept of their own well-being and also their own reputations, to keep information as it is. And so once we start down that direction, we don't like to reverse it. And you know as well as I do, I mean, you had just about a year ago a release from the British Air Ministry of a number of sightings, from 95 to 98?
That's right.
Do you really think those 800 sightings for 3 minor years is all that's in their files?
No, it's the top of the iceberg. The tip of the iceberg, isn't it? Really.
That's correct, and the French did it a few years earlier. And it depends, of course, on how much influence can be brought to bear. You know, who our allies are, and what's to be gained by releasing the information, and what are people going to expect from it. I mean, let's face it, we are hostages of the oil situation. It permeates every aspect of our society, of our living, the consumption of oil. And just the mere thought of electrostatic energy that is generated by the planet is enough to scare the willies out of some people, because then there's no investment in nuclear, there's no investment in everything else. Our whole markets run upon the consumption of oil, the trading of oil, and its subsidies. So there's quite a lot of self-preservation involved in keeping technology managed, progress managed, and the state of imbalance managed as well.
And I totally agree with you there as well. But if there's bases on the moon, surely there must be bases on the Earth as well. Alien bases.
Oh, you're talking about alien bases on the Earth as well. I would imagine, yes. I would say that there are certain areas where you have seen more activity than others. I remember there was a time in central Mexico when we were there. We went down there in 1969, and with about I had a large piece of property up in the area, about a couple thousand meters high, in an area where George Adamski instructed us we should go because there was activity. And as it turns out, we did see a number of these crafts fly to the backside of certain mountain ranges and disappear behind them. And with about a week after showing up there, the state secret police and secret service showed up there in Mexico, and they proceeded to go all around the property with magnetic rods, metal detectors, and check everything. My father laughed and said, "Go ahead, knock yourselves out." And as they were doing it, the senior agent involved was standing there in our living room and was looking at the picture of one of these crafts. And he turned around and looked at my father and said these words exactly: "We know they're here. We know where they come from. We know that they're good for us, but we don't want them." And at the end of it all, they packed their stuff and off they went, and we didn't see them again. So in different parts of the world, there have been areas where we have seen more activity, areas where there are less perhaps a radar environment. In the Western Europe and the United States, we have such an intense NORAD and air traffic control radar environment. But there are places along the world. I just came back from South America, flying along the Andes there, and for hours and hours you look down there and there's not a light, not a soul, not a thing. So there are much more easier entrances and exit points into our atmosphere in different areas of the world. In the middle of the South Pacific, many of the natives talk about seeing glowing objects coming out of the ocean. That in itself, are underwater UFOs, is entire books upon themselves that have been written about that. And in fact, in my father's first book, called Why Are They Here? Spaceships from Other Worlds, he wrote that in 1967, printed by Vantage Press, and they can obtain that through us as well at the Adamski Foundation. He has a whole chronology in the book that goes back to the 1800s of sea captains and naval logs describing these crafts coming out of the water and being seen. So,
and
let
again,
us be clear. Pardon me.
Sure, go ahead.
Let us be clear about one thing. I believe for certainty that no matter where you go, historical records, you will find references to these type of crafts. If we go back several thousand years ago, we hear about the wheel within the wheel, the flying scroll, the pillar of fire by night. Chinese culture goes to flying chariots and describing topography from thousands of miles up in the atmosphere. In India, in the South Pacific, the Mayans, the Incas, there's nowhere you can go that doesn't have references to these type of vehicles. In more modern times, we have shot at them, and they have not retaliated. And so if we want to at least have a grasp on reality, anyone with this type of technology that comes here for thousands of years, they could have easily taken us over anytime, anywhere, anyway. And they haven't, and they won't. So while we hear a great deal of promotion of fear and aggression, let us remember that the masters of the promotion of fear and aggression, we are manipulating that ourselves here on our own planet. So let us try at least to be somewhat unbiased and neutral when we think about what comes from space. We have such a predetermination to consider everything from space as a threat, as a monstrosity, as some kind of bizarre creature, because we are programmed that way through science fiction and all the books we read and every time we see a little program and what have you. But that is not necessarily the case, and I believe historically, if we go back from the mid-1950s as far back as we want to research, that has never been the case. So while we're looking at the area of from the late 50s forward where we have worked to debunk, we have also worked to scare our own population. And I think that people need to rationally think about what comes by scaring our own people away from any type of interaction and progressive movement towards space.
Well, also...
And that in itself...
No, sure, go ahead.
Go ahead.
I can cut this out. Go on. Go ahead. Finish off what you're going to say. Sorry.
Yeah. And that in itself should give us cause to question some of what we hear. The things that I hear out in this field are so laughably ridiculous at some point, but I am amazed that no one questions it.
But
because my experience and my exposure has been in a much, much different area, taken in a much more serious venue by many more, shall we say, tangible sources and people.
Sure. Now, how can listeners get hold of your book and also your website?
Well, we are at adamskifoundation.com, and there's a multitude of information there about George, about the moon. Some of the articles I spoke about you'll find as collages on those pages. And there's a materials page. You can order directly from us, or if you want to go through Amazon.com, you can find us there as well.
Okay, well, we'll put a link on our website for your site and also for your book as well. I just want to say, Glenn, thank you so much for joining us today, and I look forward to you coming back on in the future.
I look forward to being with you again, and thank you for taking the time and in the interest to expose some of this material to your listeners. I think that they indeed should be very grateful for that opportunity.
Glenn Steckling, thank you so much for joining us. To find out more information on Glenn Steckling, go to my website, themoreshow.co.uk, and look up Glenn Steckling under past guests. Well, until next time, be safe.